Titian, Giorgione, Tintoretto, Veronese, the great Venetians. Today, you will experience 30 minutes of concentrated beauty and the fascinating story of 5 great geniuses of the Venetian Renaissance. What made the Venetian school different? Florence is considered the birthplace of the Renaissance, where true giants like Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael created their masterpieces. I talked about this in another video. I'll leave a link in the description. How did it happen that several painting schools emerged in relatively small Italy? This is going to be a fascinating story. Pour yourself some tea. It's all about Venice's location. As you know, Venice is a seaside city situated on many islands connected by bridges. In the 14th century, it wasn't even connected to the mainland. The first railway bridge appeared only in 1846 and the automobile bridge as late as 1933. All of Italy was a patchwork of independent states and republics, and Venice, along with Genoa, was the richest and most developed city in Italy, as it was the most important port connecting Europe with the rest of the Mediterranean, and above all, by the Silk Road. It was along this route that the plague reached Europe in the 14th century, wiping out an estimated 30 to 50% of the entire European population. The population of the Venetian Republic, which was the first to take the hit, catastrophically decreased by 60%. The epidemic practically wiped out all the professionals. Remember, I told you in the video about the Renaissance that in the Middle Ages, knowledge of crafts was passed down in only one way, from master to apprentice. Since the printing press hadn't been invented yet and books were too expensive, only the wealthy and the church could afford them. So, as a result of the epidemic, many chains of unique craft knowledge, including painting, were lost, and this led to a break in continuity. With Byzantine roots. Byzantium is the eastern part of the Roman Empire, characterized by the dominance of orthodoxy and the corresponding church painting. Moreover, the very location of Venice on the canals made the humidity level so high that no frescoes could be preserved at all. Therefore, such an important initial stage that gave rise to the Renaissance in Florence, like wall church painting, was absent in Venice at the beginning of the early Renaissance. Painting in this city was mainly focused on icons in the Byzantine style, and when oil paints appeared, they quickly became dominant in painting. And so, in the middle of the 15th century, the Venetian Republic began to open up to the rest of Italy and finally integrate into its cultural space. At that time, the Renaissance was already in full swing in Florence, and its echoes reached Venice as well, and they mixed with the abundant Byzantine and Eastern ornaments. This resulted in an entirely new movement called the Venetian Renaissance, characterized by much bolder use of color and more dramatic subjects. And it all began with Bellini, Giovanni Bellini. Giovanni Bellini is considered the founder of the Venetian Renaissance. We know little about his early biography. Art historians argue about his birth date, but most agree on the year 1433. He was born into the family of the artist Veronese, an influential and well-known painter in Venice, with his own workshop, where Giovanni worked as an apprentice until the age of 30. Then he opened his own workshop and began painting portraits of the local nobility, quickly achieving success. By 1464, he received his first government commission. It's important here to talk about the structure of the painting craft in Venice and in all of Europe. To practice the craft of painting, you had to join a guild. A guild is like a trade union. It monitored compliance with quality standards, provided legal protection for artists, helped find clients, and supported families after the artist's death or in case of illness. For all this, artists paid dues. Without guild membership, an artist had no right to open a workshop or put his name on a work. Arte dei Depentori was the name of the Venetian Guild, and it was the one that managed all the art business in the Republic. There were no art schools at that time. To become an artist, there was only one way: to become an apprentice to a master, work for him for 5-7 years, then become a journeyman, spend a few more years, and finally create a graduation work that would be approved and sold by a special commission. And only then would the artist receive the title of master. Until that moment, neither his name nor his contribution to the work belonged to him. All of this was the property of the master, which is why masters often suppressed talented journeymen and did not give them permission for the final work. And only after receiving the title of master did the artist have the right to open his own workshop, take on apprentices, and start signing paintings with his own name. However, at that time paintings were rarely signed, and that's exactly why we have such difficulties attributing paintings from that era. Painting was just an ordinary craft. You wouldn't sign every pot you made, would you? After opening a workshop, the second commercial side of the matter came into play: finding a client, the most important client. At that time, there was the wealthy Catholic Church, which commissioned the painting of cathedrals, and the nobility, who ordered their official portraits. But as I mentioned above, frescoes did not survive in the humid climate of Venice. Therefore, it turned out that, unlike all other regions of Italy, the nobility of the city, in terms of importance as patrons, could easily compete with the church. And this, of course, had a strong impact on the subjects and on how boldly artists were willing to experiment. The nobility won't send you to the stake if you paint a portrait in an unusual pose or in a provocative outfit. The title of State Artist of the Republic was considered especially honorable, as it gave the right to paint the first official portraits. Venetian doges, as the lifelong elected heads of the Venetian Republic were called, held unlimited power but were essentially elected monarchs. Such portraits were a kind of ritual anointing for the leadership of the Republic, displayed for public viewing and serving as the brightest advertisement for the artist who created them. But let's return to Giovanni Bellini. He received his first state commission for painting a polyptych in the church of San Giobbe in 1464. The work took a whole 4 years, and after that he traveled around the surroundings of Venice for a long time, practicing landscape painting, and this powerful skill soon became his superpower. When he was 37, Giovanni's father died, leaving him not a single penny. Apparently he was angry that Giovanni opened his own workshop instead of continuing the family business. But in that case, Giovanni would have had to wait for his father's death to become a master, and as we already know, all talented artists are extremely ambitious. In 1474, Bellini became the official painter of the Republic, and in 1776, the Sicilian artist Antonello de Messina arrived in the city, having just returned from Milan. And he brought a revolution to Venice, the technique of oil painting, which he had learned from Flemish artists in Milan. Before that, artists painted with tempera, a paint based on egg yolk mixed with pigments. Tempera dried very quickly and therefore didn't allow for smooth color transitions, while oil paints took several days to dry, and they could be made semi-transparent, which allowed artists to layer one translucent coat over another, mixing colors directly on the canvas and creating color transitions that were completely impossible when working with tempera. It was this technique, called sfumato, that Leonardo da Vinci was developing in Florence. At that time, all four great masters of the Italian Renaissance were working in Florence: Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, Michelangelo, and Raphael. The High Renaissance in Florence would begin in another 15 years, but the early Renaissance was already coming to an end, and the revolution was already underway. Let me remind you that in Florence, artists were going crazy over the recently discovered linear perspective. The effect of perspective lines converging toward the center, which created a sense of depth in the composition, brought the depiction of the human body to anatomical perfection. And they learned to work with complex light and shadow, which makes the paintings much more realistic. However, in Venice, due to its isolation, people only had a vague idea about this. It was a completely different time. A modern 1-hour flight from Venice to Florence in those days would turn into a week-long journey or even longer. If something beautiful and advanced was created in Florence, you had to travel there to see it. A fresco couldn't be scraped off the wall and moved elsewhere, and oil painting had only just appeared, so artists in Venice could only learn about what was happening through rumors and engravings, which didn't convey the colors, or when masters from other cities came to town and shared their secrets. This happened when Antonello Messina came to Venice and shared the technique of oil paints and some of his skills with Giovanni Bellini. Soon, Bellini created the Pesaro altarpiece using this technique. After that, oil paints, which are resistant to moisture, began to gain popularity among Venetian painters and marked the beginning of the early Renaissance in Venice. Giovanni Bellini would become the founder of the Venetian Renaissance. He adopted the technical foundations of linear perspective from black and white engravings, but never achieved the same mastery in depicting the human body. But he would fully embody in his works the visual experience of traveling around the surroundings of Venice, adding detailed depictions of landscapes, fortresses, and the sky. His portraits and figures would remain a naive blend of Gothic and Byzantine styles, two-dimensional, with almost primitive shadows, unnatural poses, old-fashioned depictions of clothing folds, and iconographically detached facial expressions. Many young artists aspired to join his workshop, which was the most famous and wealthy in Venice at that time. And almost all the geniuses of the next generation, in one way or another, would go through this school. In 1483, Bellini was appointed as the official painter of the Most Serene Republic of Venice and was exempted from paying taxes to the treasury. And after 1507, he began painting the whole of the Great Council in the Doge's palace. Although in his later years Bellini was extremely busy, most of his works have not survived. In 1507, his brother Gentile Bellini died, bequeathing Giovanni an album with sketches by their father Jacopo on the condition that he would finish Gentile's unfinished painting, the Preaching of St. Mark in Alexandria. This condition was duly fulfilled literally just before his death. He died in 1516 at the venerable age of 83, which was remarkable for that time. Giorgione. The second genius of the Renaissance in Venice in terms of birth was Giorgione, who was born in 1477. At the very peak of Bellini's prominence, he became Bellini's apprentice, and his first known work appeared in 1497. We know very little about Giorgione's life. It was very short, as he died in 1510, not even reaching the age of 33. But during this short period, he managed to make a step just as significant as Leonardo da Vinci did in Florence. 20 years before him, he completely abandoned the canonical and strict Byzantine style, while at the same time adopting from his teacher the technique of depicting landscapes in the background. In 1500, Da Vinci came to Venice for a short time to sell the city his engineering plans for the construction of its defenses, and we know that they met briefly. Of course, Leonardo didn't have any paintings with him, but knowing his willingness to share his knowledge, watch my video about the Italian Renaissance for more on this. I have no doubt that, although Giorgione couldn't see Leonardo's works, they talked a lot about the sfumato technique invented by Leonardo. It's possible that Leonardo made sketches and Giorgione saw them. After that, Giorgione's paintings and later Bellini's changed. They featured those very subtle color transitions that were only possible by repeatedly layering semi-transparent paint on top of each other. In 1504, Giorgione completed the commissioned altarpiece Madonna of Castelfranco, intended for the chapel of the noble Costanzo family in the Cathedral of Castelfranco Veneto. And in 1508, together with Titian himself, whom I will talk about a little later, they created exterior frescoes commissioned by the Senate of the Venetian Republic. The buildings of the German Fondaco dei Tedeschi on the Grand Canal were a unique experience for Venice, a city with a humid climate that is unsuitable for fresco painting. Unfortunately, the experiment was unsuccessful, and only a small fragment has survived to this day. Despite his short career, the spirit of the true High Renaissance was already strongly evident in Giorgione's later works. Man as the center of harmonious unity with nature, the depiction of the divine nature of man not through church canons and attributes, but through the manifestation of his inner divine essence. That very humanism which at that moment was tearing Florence apart. Giorgione, without having the opportunity to see the works of the great Florentines, managed to make a huge leap, overcoming Venice's 20-year lag. But still man, there's something missing in his paintings, you have to admit. They lack realism, shadows, and that makes his paintings somewhat two-dimensional, flat. But Titian will fix that. The theme of the interpenetration of two worlds, the harmony of the heavenly and earthly worlds, found its expression in a world masterpiece, one of the best works in the history of visual art, created by the brush of Giorgione, The Sleeping Venus. The painting depicts a nude goddess, peacefully dozing under a tree, since she remains invisible to people. A similar mood permeates another famous painting by Giorgione, The Pastoral Concert, which was completed after the artist's death, just like The Sleeping Venus. His friend Titian, he died in 1510 during a renewed outbreak of the plague, leaving behind a short but immeasurably intense legacy, and passing the baton to his best friend, Titian. Art historians agree that Titian was born in 1488, 11 years after Giorgione. He showed great talent for painting from an early age and soon became an apprentice. Besides Bellini, that's why Bellini is called the Patriarch of the Venetian Renaissance. In the workshop, he became very close friends with Giorgione, but being younger than him, he closely followed his older friend's style in his works and even finished his last unfinished pieces, including the mentioned Sleeping Venus. While working in the workshop of the main artist of Venice, together with Giorgione, they created the exterior frescoes of the German warehouse building on the Grand Canal. But until his death, Titian remained in the shadow of his older colleague after the death of Giorgione in 1510 and Bellini in 1516. Titian simply had no competitors left, and he applied for the title of state artist, which he received, becoming the main artist of Venice at the age of 28. The early period of Titian's work bears traces of strong influence from Giorgione. However, even during this period, his individual style begins to emerge, a much more realistic depiction of the human body and masterful work with light and shadow. During this period, he painted many portraits, biblical and mythological scenes, as well as Madonnas, including the famous Woman with a Mirror and Sacred Love, Earthly Love. And in 1545 he became the first of the Venetian masters to finally leave Venice for Rome, where he painted portraits of the Pope himself and was able to study the works of Raphael and Michelangelo firsthand. And this completes his development as a high Renaissance artist. His paintings acquire deep shadows and much more anatomically plausible and complex human bodies. Titian's mastery reaches such heights that his fame spreads far beyond Venice. He even received an audience with the head of the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Charles V, who promised him his patronage. During their second meeting, which took place in Bologna in 1533, the emperor elevated Titian to the rank of count, granting him the title of Count Palatine and Knight of the Golden Spur. As a court painter, he was also under the patronage of Federico Gonzaga, the Duke of Mantua. He enjoyed great influence and respect, and in his time was considered the leading artist of Italy. Titian developed a special technique. While canvases were usually primed with white paint, Titian always used a colored primer, often red, so that when it showed through the upper layers of paint, it gave the painting warmth after priming. He would literally apply 3 or 4 large, precise brushstrokes to indicate the human body, one for the head, the body, the arms, and the legs, and then leave it like that for several days to evaluate the result. Witnesses say that he was always so precise that from these 4 brushstrokes you could already guess the pose, gender, and even the mood of the hero or heroine, the canvases. Fans of Titian's work even tried to buy these sketches as evidence of his genius. Then Titian would add halftones, paint in the details, the shadows, and in the end he would blend, moving his fingers, always with his fingers. If he found any inaccuracies, he would ruthlessly scrape off part of the canvas and absolutely did not tolerate improvisation. He believed that art could not be unprepared or spontaneous. It would be interesting to hear his argument with the Impressionists who, 300 years later, would make spontaneity the new law of painting. Titian said that there are only 3 colors in painting, red, black, and white, and if you pay attention, almost all of his paintings consist of reddish-brown tones. Whoever wants to become a painter, said Titian, should know no more than 3 colors, white, black, and red, and use them with understanding. His famous Penitent Mary Magdalene was created during this period in 1565 when the artist was already 78 years old. And look at how much it differs from his earlier works of this type, not only in its red-brown palette, but also in its execution. Here, there are already deep, almost natural shadows. Notice the face. Half of it is almost hidden in shadow, and that's exactly what usually happens with the contrasting light of a candle in the studio. This is something he didn't do in his works from Rome. And is that what distinguishes the Renaissance from the medieval Byzantine tradition? And it's precisely the skillfully applied shadows that create realistic volume and texture. Titian became so influential and famous that his fame spread far beyond Venice. He was commissioned to paint portraits by the Emperor of the Roman Empire, Karl V, and later by his son Philip II. He worked with all the princely families, patricians, bankers, and military leaders. One of his portraits could cost 500 to 700 ducats, and for 300 ducats in Venice, you could buy a decent house. By the middle of his life, Titian had become the most famous and respected artist in Italy, and even in all of Europe. Having a noble title, he could negotiate as an equal with monarchs and the highest nobility. But in his later years, Titian, already resting on the laurels of a genius, changed his style once again. And I want to draw your attention once again to the fact that an artist's style changes instantly as soon as he stops depending on the money of his patrons. We saw this with Claude, Monet, Picasso, Goya, Degas. In his later years, Titian's brushstroke becomes less careful and even careless. The colors become darker, blue appears in them, and the shadows deepen even more. revealing to us a completely new artist who made a leap from the refined and glamorous Renaissance to an almost dark grunge, more reminiscent of Goya's black paintings. Compassion is the last painting by Titian, created by him in 1576 and supposedly finished after his death by Palma the Younger. This dark spot marks the end of the artist's career. He died of the plague in his workshop right while working and was found on the floor with a brush in his hand. To complete the picture, I will briefly tell you about two more artists, the last geniuses of the Venetian Renaissance, who lived and worked almost at the same time. They were followers of Titian, but practiced completely different approaches to painting, or more precisely, to shadows. These are Tintoretto and Veronese, and it would be very interesting if you write in the comments which one you liked more. Tintoretto was born in 1518 when Bellini and Giorgione had already died, and their place was gradually being taken by Titian. When Tintoretto was 12 years old, he was sent to be an apprentice to Titian, but he stayed there for only 10 days, after which Titian, for some unknown reason, refused to teach him. There are two assumptions about this. Some believe that Titian felt competition from the young talent, while others think that their styles were too different, and that is why Titian refused to teach the newcomer. But I think that a 12-year-old boy can't really have a style yet, and such a teenager certainly couldn't be a threat to the much more experienced Titian. Titian, being at the height of his fame, must have been very selective about whom he accepted as students. And Tintoretto most likely just didn't pass the 10-day trial period. We don't know whether he studied under anyone after that, or if he was a brilliant self-taught artist. But already in 1539, at the age of 20, he was painting building facades in Venice, and later he started working on paintings as well. Despite his unsuccessful apprenticeship, Tintoretto idolized Titian and learned a lot from him. For example, like Titian, he mastered modeling with wax and clay and used these skills to construct his paintings with the help of three-dimensional models. By making doll houses populated with characters, he used these models to find the right lighting and composition. Remember this, it will be useful for our future interpretation of his paintings. Like Leonardo da Vinci, he studied the structure of the human body on corpses in institutes and made sketches to accurately reproduce human anatomy in his paintings. It was at that time that he got used to working in the dark. All this allowed him, almost without leaving Venice, to approach the mastery of depicting the human body achieved by the Florentine genius who lived half a century before him. The first success came to 30-year-old Tintoretto in 1548 with the painting The Miracle of St. Mark. The finely detailed canvas with deep dramatic shadows and incredible dynamism caused a great stir among the Venetian public. After that, he attracted attention and major patrons started seeking him out. Titian, who by that time was reigning in the city, was already 60 years old and was working mainly for foreign patrons. Other cities in Italy were actually different states, remember, and the city lacked young talent, so this niche was filled by Tintoretto and Veronese. Tintoretto's patrons were mainly religious brotherhoods, so most of his paintings are on religious subjects. But let's take a closer look at his works, how they differ from Titian's, and we immediately see that it's the extreme contrast of the figures, half of which are literally submerged in darkness. The details in the shadows of his paintings become almost indistinguishable. Researchers suggest that in this way, he emphasized the eternal struggle between light and darkness, sin and holiness in religious subjects. And this is yet another beautiful but unfounded assumption that seems far-fetched to me. The subjects themselves always depicted the struggle between good and evil. And if you remember how he constructed his paintings using models and the fact that he often worked in the dark, it immediately becomes clear that such contrast is simply the result of him reproducing, one-to-one, the figures and bodies illuminated by candles in the darkness of his studio. Such deep shadows do not exist in daylight. The air diffuses the sunlight, and in reality, shadows are always much softer. However, we've all seen that a candle or a lantern always picks out only half of an object from the darkness, leaving the other half in shadow. And if you look closely, you'll see that we observe this effect in Tintoretto's paintings, and it turns out that at night, contrasting human figures placed in a daytime landscape add a lot of drama to the scene. Tintoretto didn't like to travel and hardly ever left Venice, except for 2 trips to Rome and Mantua. Over the years, the artist became the head of a large family. He had 8 children, 2 of whom, his son Domenico and his daughter Marietta, helped their father from childhood and later also became painters. After Titian's death in 1576, he was chosen as the leading artist of Venice. He did not seek fame or wealth, often working for minimal pay, but he undoubtedly stood alongside the titans of the Renaissance, and his painting became the logical culmination of the Venetian Renaissance. Together with Veronese, he died in 1594 at the age of 75, leaving behind one of the most powerful legacies of artistic Venice. Veronese Paolo Veronese was born in Verona in 1528, 10 years after Tintoretto, into the family of a stone carver. Verona was the mainland part of the Venetian Republic. From childhood, as is often the case, he showed a talent for painting. Venetian Antonio Bodile, not the most talented but a quite decent artist, whose daughter he later married. He quickly surpassed his teacher and at about 20 years old received the title of master and began working independently. Soon, in 1551, he received a commission from the Venetian branch of the influential Giustiniani family to paint an altarpiece for their chapel in the church of San Francesco della Vigna. And a year later, Cardinal Ercole Gonzaga commissioned him to paint the altarpiece The Temptation of St. Anthony for the Mantuan Cathedral. And just a year later, in 1553, Veronese finally received a major commission in Venice, the decoration of the ceiling in the Hall of the Council of Ten in the Doge's palace. That's how the 25-year-old artist moved to Venice. Titian and already the energetic young Tintoretto was challenging him. In 1556, he received his first major commission in Venice, the decoration of the sacristy and ceilings of the church of San Sebastiano. There he created a series of unique paintings with an upward perspective. Then he painted the story of Esther on the ceiling of the church of San Sebastiano, and for these works he received an award from Titian himself. This immediately placed him at the highest level of Venetian circles. That's how a young artist from a provincial town with nothing but his talent literally soared to the top of the city's art world. Veronese and Tintoretto were not enemies, rather it was just ordinary professional rivalry. Their styles turned out to be so different that clients simply chose the one they liked more. We'll take a closer look at him a bit later. And in 1562 he was commissioned to create the largest painting of his career. It was commissioned by Benedictine monks for the San Giorgio Maggiore monastery on a small island of the same name, opposite St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. They insisted that it be enormous, 66 square meters, the blue pigment contained precious lapis lazuli, and that it feature many figures. The painting features several portraits, including portraits of Titian and Tintoretto, as well as a self-portrait of Veronese himself. The scene depicts the first miracle performed by Jesus, turning water into wine. At the wedding at Cana, that's what it's called, the wedding at Cana. And here, pay attention to how skillfully he works with shadows. Not only does he apply shadows from one side, but he also does it with the utmost precision. If a person is blocked from the light source by a column, an object, or another person, he puts the corresponding part of the person or even their face into shadow. I will show you his paintings, and you should pay attention to this aspect. The artist was clearly fascinated by the most complex play of light and shadow, trying to reproduce them with great precision, close to what we see in real life. You see how much this differs from the simple and even primitive, compared to Veronese light and shadow of Giorgione, the forefather of the Venetian Renaissance. Unlike the dense, dramatic shadows of Tintoretto, his shadows tell a story, helping us understand the arrangement and placement of objects and light sources in the scene. In my opinion, this brings everything happening before our eyes to life in an amazing way. And in 1573, Veronese completed another large painting, The Feast in the House of Levi, measuring 12 by 5 meters, which replaced a painting by Titian himself that had been destroyed in a fire. Originally, the painting was called The Last Supper, but soon he would have to change the name at the request of the Inquisition. 10 years earlier, when creating The Wedding at Cana, Veronese went all out and placed a huge number of figures in the painting. He decided to repeat his approach here as well, but The Last Supper is one of the most sacred church scenes, and the Holy Inquisition summoned the artist to court, stating that Jesus was almost lost in the painting, that the artist had pushed the star into the background. And this smells like legalism. Veronese explained to the inquisitors that artists allow themselves the same liberties as poets and madmen when telling their stories. But the priests were relentless and demanded that the painting be redone. Veronese refused and simply changed the name of the painting to The Feast in the House of Levi. That's what we agreed on. He is considered one of the outstanding artists of the Venetian school. His influence on later styles allows his works to be classified as pre-Baroque. In particular, thanks to the elegance of forms, the taste for lighting effects, realism, chiaroscuro, and the decorative nature of his compositions. He died in 1588 at the age of 66 years earlier. Tintoretto paved the way for the next transformation of Baroque art, which I will tell you about soon. Who do you like more, Tintoretto or Veronese? Write in the comments. So my friends, we have just gone through one of the most iconic periods of the Renaissance and covered 5 geniuses in a span of 150 years. In the next video, we'll move on. An incredible story, right my friends? I have one request for you. I run this channel alone and each video is a huge effort, which is why they come out so rarely. But together, we've created the best art channel on the Russian internet. That's without a doubt, and I could really use your support. Please subscribe even with the smallest donations here on YouTube or on Boosty or on Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description, and thank you for watching. Goodbye everyone.